most of the months we begin in our calendar, it's with unmediated joy, and with Av, there's definitely a lot of complexity there, as we're gonna see together. So I'm gonna share the source sheet. I'll do it by sharing my screen, but also there's a link which will be posted, and then you can also look at the Google Doc of the sheet, whatever's easier for you. So I'm gonna share my screen so you can see it on my computer. So as you see, the title was Devastation to Consolation, which is really how the flow of the month goes. And as we're going to see, that's really built into the way our sources talk about this month over millennia. The conversation always acknowledges that the first 2 weeks of the month are difficult, especially the first 9 days. Leading up to Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, as we'll talk about. And then the second half of the month has a totally different energy. So the full moon of the month in the middle of the month really like breaks it and makes a big change. And we'll get there. Hopefully we'll have time to talk about that. We're going to start with the not so easy bad news, the hard news, which is the book of Lamentations, the book of Exile, which is read on Tisha B'Av, on the fast of the 9th of Av, which is the fast that we commemorate the destruction of both ancient Jewish temples and also many other tragic events that happened throughout Jewish history. And really, Judaism as a whole, overall, is incredibly optimistic. And there's very little in Judaism that is sad for the sake of being sad or grieving or mourning without a bigger context of joy. And as we'll see, that's also true for Tisha B'Av. But nonetheless, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, really is the one day of the year when you can really say we're actively supposed to bring ourselves into a state of mourning. It's very, very unusual in our tradition for that to be the practice. There's so much emphasis generally on joy and expansive awareness, as actually we're going to see also in this class, but not on Tisha B'Av. So let's read Lamentations, Exile. Let's read the first few verses, and you'll very quickly get the idea. Alas, lonely sits the city once great with people. She that was great among nations has become like a widow. The princess among states has become a tributary. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There is none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become foes. Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. Zion's roads are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh, her maidens are unhappy. She is utterly disconsolate. Her enemies are now the masters. Her foes are at ease, because the Lord has afflicted her for her many transgressions. Her infants have gone into captivity before the enemy. So, and so on, and so on, and so on. And unfortunately, it gets even worse. The destiny of Jerusalem that's being described here is the destruction of the first Jerusalem that was destroyed by the Babylonians, is brutally described in graphic detail. The suffering, the famine, the brutality, the depravity that people are forced into. It's really tragic and quite graphic and explicit. And it's really the acting out of all of the threats that were actually given in the Torah. In two places, there are two places in the Torah which we call the rebukes, or the tochachot, the tochachas, where the Torah says, if you don't keep the commandments, bad things are going to happen. And then twice, this actually does happen in Jewish history in this ancient context. And the commentators say that the first time it happens, this time, the time the Babylonians destroy the first temple, relates to the first rebuke, the first tochacha in the book of Leviticus, and the second one relates to the second one found in the book of Deuteronomy, which is even worse. And then, as I mentioned before, other things happen throughout Jewish history, other tragic events. For example, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, just to name two famous examples. There are many others. On Tisha B'Av, those things happened on the 9th of Av as well. So on this same fast day, we're already commemorating tragedy. There's this recurring energy of mourning and grieving bad things to happen. So as you can imagine, generally in the the ride, in the journey through our calendar, this is not an auspicious time. As we're going to see, though, there's a context, and the context helps us navigate it actually with greater positivity. That is not just gloom and doom for the sake of it, and that gives us tools and clues how to mourn and grieve in a way that's actually skillful, and actually we can integrate into the rest of our lives and actually be healthy and helpful for us to live better lives. So one example of this is from this beautiful Chasidic source, the Avodat Yisrael from the Maggid of Koznetz, at the bottom of that first page. He says there are lowly days of the year, like those between the straits. I should mention between the straits refers to the whole 3-week period leading up to Tisha B'Av. So it's the 3 weeks of mourning. Tisha B'Av is the climax of, and we're going into the last 9 days of that now. So between the straits, and that the title Between the Straits, it comes from the middle verse, the third verse of that passage from Exile, just above it, where it said that Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. So the narrow places is Bein HaMetzarim. So we are now Bein HaMetzarim. And as the Maggid says, these are lowly days of the year, like the days between the straits, Bein HaMetzarim, where a person can do more to raise up sparks and more precious stones and gems. So it's a classic, typical Hasidic twist on what we might think is bad news. He's saying, when you're down in the dumps, right? When you're down, you're having a hard time, you're lower in your state of mind or your state of being in some ways. That's actually better in some ways, because there's more opportunity to raise things up that otherwise you wouldn't be able to. It's as I say, a very typical move for a Hasidic Rebbe to turn things on its head and betray in that way. Also very typical of Rabbi Nachman to say something like that too in his own way. But here it's the Maggid of Koznetz, and when he refers to sparks, he's referring back to classic kabbalistic worldview and creation story, that the whole world is actually full of sparks of the divine, and our job is to raise them up as much as we can. He's saying, when everything is going great, when you're sailing in beautiful waters and the sun is shining, then there's certain spiritual work you can't do. There's certain things you can't fix. As we remember, probably most of us know from our current situation, but I'm sure we all know from life experience as a whole, sometimes great challenge, when we look back, we realize it actually did also bring with opportunities and lessons. That's something to reflect on there. Let's keep going in the source sheet to the next page. Trying to get nicely to the next page. I might have to do something different. I might just stop sharing to be able to do it. 1 second. I'm not sure why it's doing that. I'm going to bring out a full screen. Hopefully this will work. Great. Okay. Just while I fumble with my document, does anyone have any thoughts or questions about that last source or the one before? Anyone want to share anything about that? Oh, okay. I'll keep checking in with you guys. So feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to, or just to say something if you want. I'm going to share my screen again so we can see that document. So at the top of the next page, you'll see this beautiful teaching from Michael Kagan. Is a teacher based in Jerusalem. He actually says the Yin Yang symbol here, which is normally associated with Taoism, is actually potentially a map of the Jewish calendar. And we can understand the white within the dark as Hanukkah, that festival of hidden secret light in the darkness. And then we can understand over here where the main part of light and white begins as Tu B'Shvat, and it gradually gets lighter and whiter as we go through spring and get up to the peak of summer. And over here, when really summer is at its peak, when there's the most white around, we get the black happening in the middle of that, of Tisha B'Av. So Tisha B'Av it's the perhaps unexpected, surprising, counterintuitive black in the middle of the white. But what I love about this symbol and this teaching that relates to our calendar is, in both our calendar and in this symbol, it's clear that the white and the black, the dark and the bright, the light and the dark are so interrelated and interdependent, right? There's no existence of either one of them without the other. And that is a key idea associated with the idea of Yin and Yang from its earliest origins. And also with our calendar, we need the different energies of life that we go through in the calendar. They all teach us something that's all part of the journey. And we need to incorporate them all. It's really something that people are still rediscovering over and over again in different ways. I'm on many rabbinic listservs, and it's a pretty frequent conversation for people to say, do we really need to fast? You know, considering that Jewish people have returned to the land of Israel, we have sovereignty again over Jerusalem. Is it really necessary to still have these fasts, which we actually fasted originally for the loss of ancient Jerusalem? And there's a very vibrant conversation going on in a lot of places about how we actually need to go through mourning and grieving and missing what's broken and wrong in ourselves individually and nationally and collectively as a species and as a planet, so that we can repair what we need to repair. It's just part of healthy growth and living, would say some anyway. There's there's different opinions on that. So that's the symbol there. Now the next little passage of italics just mentions a little bit of the historic context, that the first ninth of Av, the first Tisha B'Av, was the day that the spies who were sent by Moses to spy out the land of Israel, the spies returned and they said, oh, the land is great, it's amazing, it's beautiful, it's wonderful, but we've got no chance of conquering it because the people there are too strong for us. And the people of Israel believed them. So that day was the first ninth of Av. And that is seen by our sages as setting the tone for all the tragedies that follow. Because if that wouldn't have happened, if the people would have been willing to go into the land at that point, the tradition says that everything would have been perfect from that point on. They would have gone right into the land easily, and the Messiah would have come, etc., etc. But because they didn't, we were destined to follow the human tragedies that we know have befallen us since. So that's a little bit of the context, and we'll come back to that and mention that and touch on that with some of the other sources. And after the next source, I want to hear a little bit of how you will respond to this. So think about this statement from Jerusalem Talmud Yoma and see what you think of it. Each generation in which the temple is not built is considered as if it had been destroyed in its times. I just say that one more time, then I would love to hear what you guys think about it. Each generation in which the temple is not built is considered as if it had been destroyed in its times. I'll stop sharing my screen. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Let me put it this way. It seems that the statement to me, essentially the sages there, is essentially accusing us of effectively having pretty much destroyed the temple ourselves. How does that land with you? Do you feel complicit in that? Is that an accusation you're willing to accept and take on yourself, or is it complicated? Okay, let's put it this way. You're walking down the street and somebody stops you and says, you destroyed the temple. What do you say to them? Melody, please.
Okay, I'm going to unmute you. There you go, Melody.
Thank you, Julie. I would say that there's a certain sense in what you're saying about collective responsibility. Is that no, maybe me personally, I think, but me as someone who's Jewish, that we have a collective responsibility to each other. I like what you were saying earlier about, I think it was like sparks of the divine, that we're all interconnected. I'm studying Kabbalah right now, so that just really resonated with me. And that there's sort of this collective responsibility to, and an expectation that we're not going to forget, and that we're going to continue as a people to have that. So I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but that's just what I was thinking about.
Beautiful, thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me. Does anyone else want to chip in on that? The accusation you may have destroyed the temple?
Lana?
Hi there. Hi there. I'm Lana from Toronto. as a Reform Jew, the centrality of the temple to current religious practice is just not quite there. However, that being said, we do memorialize the significance of the temple in the days of yore. In current practice, we keep it alive. It's just the nature of our worship today, being rabbinic in nature, et cetera, that we've kind of moved beyond it as an edifice, but we still retain spiritual connectedness. So I'm not sure we can take responsibility necessarily for not re-erecting an edifice as if that would be the cure-all for our spiritual ailments. I'm not sure. So therefore, I guess I'm not agreeing with necessarily being guilty of something per se. Like I said, and as much as we do still keep it very much alive. And certainly in the holiday of Tisha B'Av, we revisited. The Reform movement didn't really do much with Tisha B'Av over the last number of years, but in the last few, people have really come to value it as something to study and something to learn from.
Beautiful. Well, Lenny, you said a lot of things there. I want to especially hold up, you said about the edifice, right? The physical building itself, which I here where I live in Israel, there actually are some folks, some of you may know, who are very attached, very attached to the physical building itself. We're very concerned with the idea of rebuilding it physically and getting the physical vessels ready to use within it. And what you said resonated with me, that isn't really the heart of it, right? And actually, if we carry on, we'll go through the sheet, we'll see a lot of sources which talk about it's not just the physical building that we're missing. So brilliant. So before we go on, does anyone else want to touch in on this point about being accused of destroying the temple in our generation? Yes, please, Johnny.
Oh. There we go. Okay, there we are. So I really like what Melody said about how, I don't know if I feel the guilt, but I feel like it's a way to kind of have a connection with people that are no longer here, but are still part of you, even though they might not be physically here. It's a way to kind of have a connection with them.
Beautiful. Yeah, that resonates with me. Like, what are we really missing when we say we're missing a temple, right? Exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Okay, well, I'm going to keep coming back to you all and checking in for comments and questions. So, and you're also welcome just to raise your hand if you want at any point. For now, I'm going to share my screen again so we can see the next source. So after that is a Midrash Tanchuma. And I put in the next couple of sources just to show that when we talk about the temple in our tradition, it's not only something that is for our own benefit. In our tradition, it's really framed as something for the benefit of the whole world. So listen to this from the ancient Midrash. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, if the nations of the world would have known how beneficial for them the temple was, their armies would have surrounded it to protect it, for it was more beneficial for them than it was for Israel. And just to look at it through an academic lens, the temple in the context of other religions and cults in the Near East at the time, the function of it essentially was to make peace between heaven and earth, and especially that there will be the right balance of elements, especially water, between heaven and earth. So there will be the right amount of rain at the right time, and also the right amount of sun at the right time, and that there will be the right physical and therefore agricultural balance, so there will be harmony and not famine or drought. Also that there would be peace and justice. All these things would emanate outwards from successful worship, from faithful, true, authentic worship in the temple. Of course, it didn't work out that way. People are people. Institutionalized religion is institutionalized, and things very easily get corrupted and lost and forgotten and not done as they ideally would be. But that's the ideal, that the temple would essentially bring peace on every level of existence to people and to the ecosystem and to the whole world. And indeed, if we look at the next source from Isaiah 56:7, famous verse, Ki veiti veitefela yikare l'chol ha'amim, for my house, this is God talking, my house, God's house, shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So this is the prophecy of what the rebuilt third temple prophesied by many of the prophets, including Isaiah, this is what that third temple will be according to the prophets. Not just a temple for the Jewish people, a house of prayer for all peoples. And this is just, because we don't have much time, a very small selection of very many sources in our tradition which talk about the temple in these terms. And so we're not only talking about the connections and relationships between us as a people, though that is very important. That's certainly one of the central themes of Tisha B'Av, of the 9th of Av. But also, it's an opportunity to think about what is broken and missing in the world as a whole. Like, what would it mean for there to be a space or a connection or an opportunity for connection? It may be online like Zoom, who knows, right? But a way of connecting with people that would bring that balance and that justice and that wholeness to the world. That's what we're lacking when we say we're lacking a temple on one level. And there are many levels at play. I want to go to a totally different level in a second with the next source. But before I do, I'll just check in with you all. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions about that last piece? Speak now, or I'm going to move on. Okay, fine, I'm going to move on. But do jump in if and when you want to. The next source, as I just said, is going to go in a slightly different direction. Here we go. It's the Mo'oinayim, the Chernobyl Rebbe, a student of the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid Mezrich, an early Hasidic master. Top of the next side. So he says in his book, the Mo'oinayim, book of his teachings, written by his students actually, but it was his teachings. So he says, the inner meaning of all exile is the lowly state of consciousness, of dat, in constriction and pettiness. So that divine service is done with very little consciousness, without pleasure, remaining always below in the place of judgment. Because of this, they are in exile. As it says, all her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. That's a quote from that verse from Lamentations that I quoted at the beginning. That's where we get the name of the period, Bein HaMetzarim, in those narrow places. So we were talking before about the brokenness of the world. Like, missing a temple means the world is broken. There's no justice. There's no peace. Kind of macro and global and geopolitical injustice. And, that's one way of approaching Tisha B'Av, right? We could look at the world very easily and say, oi, like, there's a lot of war and famine and injustice in the world right now, right? There's a lot to mourn. Or we could look at the inner human state of consciousness, which arguably is the primary cause of people acting badly and creating all that injustice and brokenness. And that's what this Hasidic master wants us to do here. He's saying the real inner meaning, the inner story of exile, the exile is essentially a code word for, it means the Jewish people being in exile, but the whole world being in exile and the divine being in exile. So like a code word for all the brokenness in the world. The inner meaning of that is actually the small state of mind, the lower and petty state of mind that we find ourselves in. And especially, as he says, when we're in a place of judgment, when we are in a place of judging mind, of constantly judging and comparing things rather than able to have a more expansive approach. And specifically, he says, when divine service is not done with pleasure. And he goes on to say, what we have to work on is expanding our consciousness so we can be in a greater state of what we might call appreciation and presence, and specifically so we can do divine service with joy. Now, however you do your divine service is your business. And of course, we all have different complex journeys and relationships with what we may or may not call God, the divine, the infinite, whatever it is. But how we relate to life, is it with appreciation, expansiveness, and joy? Well, I imagine for most of us, the answer is sometimes, right? Sometimes that is available and sometimes it isn't. And it's easier and harder depending on a lot of factors going on in our own lives and in the world. So the Chernobyl Rebbe here is saying to us, that's what real liberation and real freedom from exile means. It means working on expanding our state of mind. And then when we do that, there's a knock-on effect from the inner to the outer, to what's going on in the world around us. I'm going to come back to you now and just see if anyone wants to reflect on that from your own life experience. Yes, please, Jennifer.
Hi, yeah, I kind of have some experience of that. I was kind of raised by artists and perfectionists, and so I sort of had this self-defeating kind of perfectionism thing, which I experienced very much that way, where even if I could do something perfectly, I had no joy in it because perfection was just the bare minimum. That was status quo. So if I couldn't do something perfectly, I would not attempt to do it. And when I had done something perfectly, I felt no joy. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So you're describing how for you in that particular area there was like active work you had to do to bring joy into your work there.
Yeah, I think the issue was I was so focused on myself and what other people would think, and that's what ruined it.
Right.
Yeah, and thankfully I no longer have that. So I'm grateful.
Beautiful. Yeah. Amen. I'm happy to hear that. Yeah, that would also relate to what he said about judging mind, right? When we're stuck in that state of like judging everything. Exactly. Thank you so much for that, Jennifer. Beautiful. Please, Melody.
Yeah, I don't know. It sounds sort of simplistic what I'm about to say, but it seems like overall, not necessarily in one line of what you just read, but it's a question of us working on ourselves and our, the inner change that comes. I guess the correction of those things that we need to correct, and then a lot of that, as far as what divine service we're going to do is working out in the world, is going to come out. We're going to take a whole lot more and have a lot more joy in that by working on ourselves first. Because if we're not doing that for ourselves, it's almost impossible to do that for anybody else.
Right. Beautiful. Yeah. Amen to that. I mean, I think that's a very relevant idea for us to hold at this time when there's so much awareness for obvious reasons of what's broken in the world around us. So many of us might feel drawn to contribute as much as we can to fixing that. And like you're saying, if we don't nourish ourselves and strengthen ourselves throughout that process, it's very easy for people to get burnt out and end up in a position where we actually need help from others ourselves, as well as not being able to give it outwards. So yeah, like you say, we already have to nourish ourselves so we can do good for others. Beautiful. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, let's keep moving. We got a little bit more to see. So after mourning, we have Sefer Yetzirah. This is the oldest work of Jewish mysticism. It's so old, it's before there's even what scholars will call Kabbalah, so I call it Proto-Kabbalah. And tradition says it may even go all the way back to Abraham. That's how old it's maybe seen as being in the tradition, or it may be from the time of the Mishnaic sages, or maybe a little bit later, but certainly it's still very much in the ancient world. And before, as I said, any other work we have of mysticism in our tradition. And in every month, Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, it says there is a letter associated with that month and also a human faculty or sense. So seeing or hearing or sleeping or anger or eating. And here for our month of Av, we have the letter Tet and we have the sense of hearing. That's the first line in his teaching. He made the letter Tet king over hearing. And then every month of the year has one of these verses, one of these paragraphs, very poetic and mysterious written about it. To be honest, Sefer Yetzirah, especially parts of it like this, reads a little bit like a book of magic spells, kind of describing the primal elements of creation for people to invoke and work with in a spiritual way, rather than most of our texts, which kind of tell us information. This doesn't really work like most other texts we have. So what we can glean from it is the letter Tet and the sense of hearing have a special relationship to our month. A letter Tet we don't have time to go into in this short class, but I will say it's the first letter of the word Tov, goodness, and that's a very important thing. The tradition talks about it a lot. And also the shape of the letter Tet is that it closes in on itself at the top and it is therefore seen as representing hidden goodness. So we have the association with the word goodness, Tov, but also that it's closed in at the top in a way that the goodness is concealed. So that's all I'm going to say about letter Tet for now. And if you're curious, you're welcome to email me. My email's on the sheet. And I'll send you some more sources about it. It's fascinating. But the sense of hearing, I want to talk about a little bit more. This is really amazing stuff for us to work with this month when we're thinking about what is the work we can do so that we can turn this period of grieving, of mourning, into hopefully a productive, constructive time for ourselves and a healing time for the world. The sense of hearing is very important. So shmiya, the Hebrew word for hearing, also means deeply internalizing and understanding and even reflecting on. So it's not only just hearing something, it's really taking it deep inside. And in the next source from Isaiah 55:3, we see this. It says, "Incline your ear and come to me. Listen, and you will be spiritually revived. And I will make with you an everlasting covenant, the enduring loyalty promised to David." So in the second line, the Hebrew is shim'u, shmiya, right? From the word shmiya, from the same word as in Sefer Yetzirah, for listen. So this listening we're being asked to do by the prophet is the kind of listening that brings spiritual revival, right? A listening that changes somebody's whole state of being. And then from that deep listening comes this enduring loyalty promised to David. That's a reference to the Messiah, right? The Messiah is from the line of David. So if you listen right, there'll be a spiritual revival, and then you'll be opening the way for the messianic redemption for the whole world. That's how important and how pivotal listening deeply and listening correctly is seen in this month, in this opportunity. And one more thought about this from Chasidic, from Rav Tzadok Cohen, great Hasidic master from Poland. He says, quoting that line, he says, he made the letter Tet, king over hearing, from Sefer Yetzirah, and he says, the essence of hearing is for something to enter into the depths of the heart so that the heart hears, so that those who listen will be spiritually revived. So just like I was saying, if we can turn our ear into a receptor for the heart, and we can really open redemptive possibilities. That is, when I learn these sources, I think especially of my work in nonviolent communication, or some of you may know it as compassionate communication. So a way of listening and being in the world and talking and sharing, devised by a man called Marshall Rosenberg relatively recently. And essentially, in a way, it's just plain common sense. It just says, listen deeply to what you and what other people really need before coming to the conclusion of the process with them. Like really trying to incorporate that into the process. It's a bit more involved, there's a bit more to it, but that's definitely a big part of it. And when we do that, the outcomes can be very different. The outcomes can be really redemptive for everyone involved. I'll just come back to everyone there and see if anyone has any thoughts on that. That's fine. I guess you're all listening really well. Oh no, please, Jennifer.
Hi, yeah, that kind of made me think of a book I was just starting to read. I downloaded from my Kindle, and it's called, I think it's called You're Not Listening. And it's about how, at least in America, we're kind of a nation of talkers, and we just don't possess the listening skill collectively right now. It's all about giving speeches and posting on social media. So we just don't practice listening. It seems like that's not rewarded. It seems we're rewarded when we talk rather than when we take things in and listen. Yeah, and I don't know if that's just an American thing or, but it does seem to be part of our culture that we're expected to constantly have an opinion on every little thing and always be trying to convince others. Yeah, so that's kind of what I got out of that.
Yeah, as somebody who doesn't live in America but used to, when I'm looking at America from far away, that does seem to be, unfortunately, part of what's going on there. I have to say, from a distance, it does seem that way. But I have to also say that's part of what's going on in other places too, including where I live and including where I used to live in England. It's something I think a lot of people need to work on. And you might be right that it's especially easy to see that in our world today in a lot of ways, unfortunately. Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. There was a comment on the chat.
From Steve.
Julie?
This is in response to your previous question about us feeling if we are responsible for the destruction of the temple. Isn't that the nature of Judaism, making it personal? Isn't it the same reason that at the Seder, every person should feel as if he or she were going out of Egypt? Or on Purim, when we are required to hear the Megillah twice? Or for that matter, almost all of the traditions, doing them gives some relevance to today in our lives.
Beautiful. Yes, absolutely true. And you know, I love the comparison to all those other festivals. I think whenever there's a tradition, a law, a practice of, say, for example, reading the Megillah or reenacting the Exodus, or here taking the destruction personally, I think it's very healthy to ask why, you know, and what are we supposed to be learning from it, and how are we supposed to be growing with it. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at. But yeah, definitely a wonderful comparison to all those other practices. I think that's really true. And that really relates to what I was saying at the beginning about the map of the year, having these different energies. And, you know, we go through ups and we go through downs. It's all part of a journey that overall hopefully has balance and wholeness and helps us grow as individuals and collectives. So yeah, thank you for that, Steve. Let's look at a little bit more of the source sheet together, because I want to bring a little bit of good news before our time is over. So the Torah says, I mentioned before the tochacha, actually the two tochachas, the two passages of rebuke where the Torah says, if you don't do good stuff, then bad stuff will happen to you. And this is from the second tochacha, which is the worst of the worst. It's just a list of horrible things, which unfortunately did happen in our history. And really, after a staggering list of terrible things, the Torah says this surprising verse. I'm actually reading here from Babylonian Talmud, Iraq and 11a, but it begins with a quote from the Torah in Deuteronomy 28:47. So the Torah says, because you did not serve the eternal, your God, in joy and gladness, and then the verse continues, then all these bad things happen to you. So it's just, before we even look at what the Talmud says about that verse, don't even read on, I just want to highlight what that verse in the Torah says. All of the bad things happen to you, the exile and the destruction and the famine and the disease, and the worst of the worst of the worst. Everything bad that happened according to the Torah, because we did not serve the eternal, our God, in joy and gladness. That's it. That's what was lacking. It's a staggering claim, right? Absolutely mind-blowing if we take that seriously. It goes back to when we look at what the Mourning, the Chernobyl Rebbe said before, that what's really lacking in a broken world where there's so much injustice and suffering, what's really lacking is our own inner expansive consciousness, appreciation, pleasure, and joy. This is what he's basing it on, right? He's going back to the Torah that's saying this. So what do the sages say this means? Here in the Talmud, they say, what is this service that is joy and gladness? This must mean singing. And I see a very strong connection to what we were just talking about, that the sense or the faculty that needs to be redeemed this month is listening, right? We talked about listening to the heart of other people, deep listening that can be redemptive in our interpersonal relationships. Also, what about that kind of listening to music? Could be music that you're making yourself or music from anyone else. That deep kind of listening to shirah, to singing, to poetry, to music, that changes our state for the better and brings us closer to a redeemed state and also the world. It's a very, very strong invitation. And that's surprising, maybe, because the first 9 days of this month of Av are a time when a lot of people traditionally don't listen to music. So there's a very interesting inversion happening there of, what does it mean to redeem this faculty of hearing? Actually, the sages say it means singing, but at this particular time, maybe it's actually in having less musicality in our lives. But then from after the 9th of Av onwards, our month totally changes direction, it totally changes trajectory. And we just have a few minutes left. So I'm just going to give over the good news of what's happening in the rest of the month very quickly. I'm not going to have time to read all these sources on the inside. I'm just going to tell you what they say. So the next source from Zechariah says that all of the fast days we have for the brokenness in the world, the exile, the temples being destroyed, and so on, are all going to be turned into festivals. That's the prophecy of Zechariah, the Moedim Tovim. So including the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, it's going to be a festival because there's going to be a lot to celebrate. The many peoples and multitude of nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and to entreat the favor of the Eternal. So it's not just a festival for us, it's a festival for all of humanity. All the brokenness we're experiencing right now is going to be totally flipped on its head. So already we see that flip from the silence, the lack of music, to celebrating, right? A festival in our tradition means a lot of singing and dancing and music. And then we see another teaching from a great Chasidic master, B'nai Sascha. It's based on the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the great Kabbalist of the 1500s in Sfat, here in northern Israel. And he says there's a teaching that the Messiah is born on the 9th of Av. And he says this is because the Messiah is a very elevated and inclusive soul, and it must be born from the most supreme spiritual union, which we can understand through love in this material plane. And he says, what does that mean? He says, in this world, when people love their friends or their spouse, this love is not fully recognized while they're together, but when they want to separate and go roaming far off for a long time, then their souls are infused with overflowing and fierce love. But what he's saying is, on the 9th of Av especially, it's the lowest day of the year, as we've been saying. It's when we focus most of all on what's lacking and broken in the world. And actually, it's at that point that we miss, you could say, the divine or goodness or peace or justice. We miss what's good in the world the most because we're most focused on what's lacking. And he says it's exactly at that point of lowness and of focusing on what's missing, because we are yearning most strongly for what's missing. From there, the most elevated and inclusive soul can be born. The Messiah can be brought to the world. So that misery of Tisha B'Av is not just misery. It's actually a very redemptive yearning for what is missing on the world. And the great Chasidic master, we read a little bit from him before, the Avodat Yisrael, and the next source says, even on the 9th of Av, which appears as darkness, even though one must weep with a bitter spirit over all that happened to us on that day, nonetheless, one must rejoice the king's heart with joy of the future, when Menachem, that's the word for the Messiah, is born and he will redeem us quickly. So not only must we be happy on the 9th of Av that the Messiah is being born, but we actually have to make the divine happy. We have to rejoice the king's heart. So God is depressed, and we have to cheer God up, saying, don't worry, God, don't be sad, it's Tisha B'Av, because actually the Messiah is being born today. And actually that sets the trajectory for the next of the month, or the rest of the month. I'll just say very quickly what the last couple of sources say about that. As we go forward from the 9th of Av, we see that the whole second half of the month relates to rachamim, compassion, whereas the first half of the month was hard. This is in the next teaching from the B'nai Sascha, that he gives the kind of kabbalistic background for this. Essentially, he's saying the first half of the month, difficult, mourning, grieving, brokenness. But the second half of the month, after the full moon of Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, which I'll mention more in a second, it's a beautiful, compassionate, loving energy, and that actually leads into the next month of Elul, which is a month of loving return to the divine, which is also associated in a lot of levels with intimate, loving relationship with the divine. So one last source, which is just to introduce Tu B'Av, because it's a minor festival, it's not so well known, a lot of us might not know what it is. The Mishnah here in Tanit says, about Tu B'Av and Yom Kippur, the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur, it says, there were no more joyous festivals for Israel than these 2 days. For on them, the daughters of Jerusalem used to go out dressed in white garments, borrowed ones, in order not to cause shame to those who had them not of their own. These clothes were to be immersed. And so the daughters of Jerusalem went out and danced in the vineyard, saying, young men, look and observe well whom you are about to choose. Do not seek beauty, but rather seek a virtuous family. In other words, it was a day of people pairing up. It was a day of dancing, right? The maidens are dancing, and of young people and old people getting together to build a life together. And as it says, there were no more joyous days in those days. So I'm going to turn off screen share and come back to you now. I know we just covered a lot, so I'm going to quickly recap just those last few sources, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts and responses about all that. So we saw that Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is a very hard day. It's about focusing on what's broken in ourselves, individually, in the world. But we also saw it's the day that the Messiah is born, right? And that we're focusing on what's broken to make an opportunity to yearn for what's missing in the world. And that actually we can therefore see it really positively. And that even as the Avodat Yisrael said, we can even turn to the divine on this day and say, cheer up, God, it's okay. Something good is going to come from all this brokenness. And that's our prerogative to do. I find it mind-blowing the tradition says that. And then we see how after the ninth of Av, all this pain and brokenness that we're focusing on right now is really transformed. And the listening and the shirah, the song, the music that was mentioned before, actually really manifests beautifully. On the 15th of Av, it's a festival of music, of dancing, of people pairing up in love. And that leads us into the new month of Elul after this one, which will be really all about loving return to the divine. So I know that last bit was a little bit quick, so I'll be happy to, if anyone wants to ask any questions about it. I would also love to hear if anyone has any thoughts about any of it, the last bit or any of the rest of it, and the whole journey.
Sarah had a question from the chat. Who wrote the book of Lamentations and why did they write it?
Oh, wonderful question. Thank you. So was it Sarah you said asked a question? Thank you, Sarah. So the book of Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah, and he wrote it seemingly to document what he was actually seeing going on around him. He was literally there, a witness to the destruction of the first Commonwealth in Jerusalem and the first temple. And he was saying, this is what I'm seeing with my own eyes. And he has a very difficult role because he tried to warn the people it was coming before. He tried to avert the tragedy, and like almost all of our prophets, nobody listened to him. So then he had to watch it happen, and then he cataloged literally all the tragedies, and then fortunately he also had the role of prophesying the return and the redemption after, over the return to the land for the second Commonwealth.